A homemade meal is the ultimate gesture of care. On a crisp afternoon in July 2023, 4 elderly guests sat down at a meticulously set dining table in a quiet rural town. Before them rested a golden, perfectly baked Beef Wellington. It was supposed to be a lunch of healing, a chance to mend a fractured family. But woven into the layers of pastry and savory meat was one of the deadliest toxins known to science. Within days, 3 of those guests would be dead. And the woman who cooked it, she walked away entirely unharmed. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Nestled in the agricultural heartland of Victoria, Australia, the neighboring towns of Korumburra and Leongatha were the kind of places where a locked front door was an afterthought. It was a region defined by miles of dense pastures, dairy operations, and deep, multi-generational ties. At the very center of this tight-knit social fabric were the Pattersons and the Wilkinsons. Don and Gail Patterson were universally revered. They were the archetype of quiet, steadfast reliability, devoted churchgoers, always the first to volunteer, and always the last to leave a community hall. Gail's sister Heather and her husband Ian Wilkinson shared this elevated social standing. Ian served as the pastor of the local Baptist church, acting as the spiritual anchor for hundreds of residents. Together, these 4 elders formed an untouchable pillar of moral and social respectability. Don and Gail's son, Simon Patterson, grew up under the immense weight of this spotless reputation. He was a capable, hardworking man who eventually crossed paths with Erin. On paper, Erin was an ideal match. She was bright, highly organized, and eager to cement her own place within the local hierarchy. When they married, it seemed like a perfect alignment of values. Over the years, they accumulated quiet wealth, investing heavily in real estate and building a life that looked flawlessly secure from the curb. Erin integrated herself into the community, even managing a local newsletter, keeping her finger on the pulse of the town. She was a mother, an astute property owner, and a woman deeply embedded in civic life. But the polished veneer of their marriage masked a growing, insurmountable friction. Behind the closed doors of their affluent lifestyle, the dynamic was steadily deteriorating. The specifics of their domestic disputes remained shielded from the congregation and their neighbors, but the suffocating pressure of maintaining a perfect image in a conservative, deeply religious town ultimately took its toll. The fracture, when it finally happened, wasn't marked by public shouting matches or shattered glass. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution of trust. Simon and Erin quietly separated, choosing to keep the mechanics of their marital collapse fiercely private. Simon moved out of their shared home, leaving Erin alone in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property situated on a quiet, tree-lined road in Leongatha. Despite the physical distance between them, their lives remained messily intertwined. They were forced to navigate shared custody of their 2 children. They were tethered by complex financial assets and real estate portfolios. And, perhaps most heavily, they remained connected by the looming shadow of Simon's devout parents. Don and Gail were strict traditionalists. The failure of their son's marriage was a profound, quiet tragedy for them. They maintained a polite, heavily strained relationship with their daughter-in-law, driven by a sense of familial duty and a desperate desire to remain close to their grandchildren. For Erin, the isolation began to compound. She found herself in a deeply precarious psychological position. She was a single woman living on a massive, isolated estate, surrounded by the physical remnants of a failed life plan. Everywhere she went in the small town, she had to navigate the unspoken judgments of a deeply religious extended family and the polite, pitying stares of the congregation. The psychological pressure to project normalcy was immense. Erin was determined to prove that she was not the villain of the separation, that the family unit could still function amicably despite the legal fracture. She wanted to demonstrate to Simon, to his parents, and to the entire community that she was still a capable, welcoming presence, and that she still deserved a seat at their table. Breakups are rarely surgical. The severance between Simon and Erin was messy, bound by shared equity, joint bank accounts, and the exhausting complexities of co-parenting. While Simon physically vacated the premises, moving out of the sprawling, multi-million-dollar Leongatha estate. His presence lingered in the legal and financial paperwork that tethered them together. For the woman left behind, remaining in the primary residence was both a victory and a psychological burden. The large, empty rooms amplified the silence of her new reality. She was acutely aware of the shifting social currents in the agricultural town. The Pattersons were local royalty, and in the unspoken court of public opinion, a divorced woman sitting alone in the family estate felt the sting of quiet scrutiny. She desperately needed to maintain the illusion of control, to prove that she was a rational, stabilizing force rather than a discarded spouse. But that fragile, forced peace was shattered in May 2022, introducing a dark, violent precursor to the tragedy that would follow a year later. Simon suddenly fell catastrophically ill. It started on a mundane afternoon with severe, twisting abdominal cramps, a dull, relentless ache that rapidly escalated into violent gastrointestinal distress. He collapsed in his home, his body violently rejecting fluids, his core temperature spiking wildly as his system went into shock. Paramedics rushed him to the local emergency room, but his physiological decline was so aggressive that rural doctors were entirely out of their depth. He was transferred to a major intensive care unit in Melbourne. Within hours of admission, his internal organs began a terrifying, cascading failure. The medical team was completely baffled. His liver enzymes were severely elevated, and his digestive tract showed signs of extreme, unexplained trauma. To stabilize his crashing system, doctors placed him in a medically induced coma. For 21 agonizing days, he remained hooked to a ventilator, hovering on the absolute razor's edge of death. The sterile hum of the life support machines was the only indication he was still fighting. Surgeons performed multiple emergency operations, cutting into his abdomen to repair ravaged intestines, operating blindly without a definitive cause. The official medical consensus was a frustrated, exhausted shrug. They hypothesized a rare mutated gut infection or an unidentified, highly aggressive pathogen. At the time, no one explicitly looked for an ingested toxin. During this harrowing 3-week period, Erin maintained a highly visible presence. She utilized social media to manage the narrative, updating the congregation and the town on her ex-husband's critical condition. She expertly played the role of the terrified, devoted former partner, asking the community to pray for a miracle. Miraculously, Simon woke up. He spent months in grueling physical rehabilitation, slowly regaining basic motor functions. The illness stripped him of his vitality, leaving him a gaunt, deeply fatigued version of the man he once was. But he also woke up with a profound, unspoken wariness. Though he had no forensic proof and no reason to formally accuse the mother of his children of foul play, a primal survival instinct had clicked into place. He distanced himself further. Their communication was stripped down to cold, sterile text messages regarding custody logistics. Dawn and Gail, having nearly buried their son, mirrored this emotional withdrawal. The familial bridge was burned, leaving only a charred framework of forced, polite interactions. By July 2023, the silence between the two camps had become deafening. The isolated homeowner decided to break it. She reached out with a seemingly olive branch, proposing a formal sit-down to discuss the future. The stated goal was to negotiate a new, smoother custody arrangement and to bury the lingering animosity. To do this, she invited Simon, along with his parents, to her home for a Saturday lunch. A home-cooked meal was presented as a gesture of goodwill, a disarming tactic designed to bring everyone back to the table. Food is the ultimate weapon of diplomacy. It implies care, preparation, and vulnerability. Dawn and Gail were highly reluctant. The prospect of walking back into their former daughter-in-law's house felt like walking into a psychological minefield. To dilute the tension, they sought reinforcements. They asked Gail's sister, Heather, and her husband, the deeply respected pastor Ian Wilkinson, to join them. The presence of the church leader and extended family would act as a social buffer, ensuring the conversation remained civil. It turned an intimate, high-stakes negotiation into a polite, manageable gathering. The expanded guest list was accepted. The menu was meticulously planned. The chosen centerpiece was a Beef Wellington, a complex, labor-intensive dish that requires focus, precise preparation, and wrapping various ingredients into a single hidden core of pastry. But as the weekend loomed, the dynamic shifted drastically. Citing a last-minute scheduling conflict, or perhaps guided by the lingering phantom ache in his surgically reconstructed gut, Simon backed out. He told his parents he would not be attending the lunch. The table was set. The preparation was complete. But the primary target had stepped off the X. Now, only 4 trusting elderly pillars of the community were walking to the front door. Saturday, July 29, 2023. The morning broke gray and cold over the sprawling Leongatha estate, with temperatures hovering in the low 40s Fahrenheit. Inside the massive, quiet house, the kitchen was already active. Preparing a Beef Wellington is not a casual culinary endeavor. It is an exercise in architecture and precision, a dish that demands focus and leaves zero room for error. The beef tenderloin must be heavily seared in a hot pan to lock in moisture, then carefully cooled. The crucial layer, the barrier between the meat and the delicate puff pastry, is the duxelle. This traditional French paste requires finely chopping mushrooms, shallots, and herbs, then slowly cooking them down in butter until all the moisture evaporates. The result is a dark, incredibly rich, earthy mixture that heavily masks the individual flavors of its ingredients. In this kitchen, amidst the chopping and sautéing, the trap was set. The dark mushroom paste was spread evenly over a layer of prosciutto. The heavy cut of seared beef was placed in the center, and the entire mass was rolled into a tight cylinder. Encased in a lattice of golden puff pastry, it went into the preheated oven. Whatever was hidden inside the duxelles was now baked into the very core of the meal. Shortly after noon, tires crunched on the long gravel driveway. Dawn and Gail Patterson arrived, bringing Gail's sister, Heather, and her husband, Pastor Ian Wilkinson. The 4 elders stepped out into the crisp winter air, bracing themselves for an afternoon they had dreaded. They were walking into the home of a woman they viewed with deep, unspoken skepticism, attempting to negotiate the emotional wreckage of their son's failed marriage. The front door opened. Pleasantries were exchanged in the foyer, the air thick with a stifling, forced civility. Coats were taken. The sprawling house felt entirely too large for a single occupant. The absence of Simon, the primary reason for this diplomatic mission, hung heavily over the entryway. Erin guided her former in-laws and their extended family to the heavy wooden dining table. The setting was immaculate. The rich, savory smell of roasted meat and buttery pastry permeated the air, offering a false, disarming sense of domestic comfort. The heavy Wellington was pulled from the oven, its crust baked to a perfect golden brown. It was brought to the table and sliced, revealing the pink center of the beef, ringed by the dense, dark layer of mushroom paste. Plates were distributed. The host served her guests generous portions of the rich meal. During the lunch, Erin served herself as well, though she would later tell investigators that she meticulously scraped the dark mushroom mixture off her own cut of beef, claiming a sudden, inexplicable aversion to the texture. The conversation around the table was painfully polite. They discussed the grandchildren, the weather, and the trivial, safe affairs of the local Baptist church. No one brought up the looming custody arrangements. No one mentioned the hostility of the divorce. Most importantly, no one spoke of the catastrophic, near-fatal gastrointestinal illness that had nearly killed Simon just 12 months prior. They chewed. They swallowed. The underlying tension slowly dissipated as the heavy, comforting food settled in their stomachs. By mid-afternoon, the plates were cleared. The 4 guests thanked their host for her hospitality, retrieved their coats, and got back into their vehicles for the short drive home. They traveled the 10 miles down the winding rural highway back to Corumbura, feeling entirely fine. That is the true insidious horror of what they had just consumed. Amatoxin, the lethal compound found in death cap mushrooms, is a biological assassin of terrifying efficiency. It does not burn the throat upon ingestion. It does not immediately churn the stomach or trigger the body's gag reflex. It is completely tasteless and odorless, easily surviving the intense heat of a roasting oven without losing a fraction of its lethality. Once swallowed, the poison quietly enters the bloodstream and travels directly to the liver. For 6 to 12 hours, the victim feels absolutely nothing. During this silent, latent window, the toxin begins a systematic dismantling of the body on a cellular level. It binds to the enzymes responsible for creating new proteins, effectively halting cell function. The liver cells quietly begin to necrotize and die off, while the host goes about their evening, watches television, and prepares for bed. Don and Gail Patterson went to sleep. Across town, Heather and Ian Wilkinson went to sleep. Midnight passed. The biological timer expired. The onset was sudden, violent, and unrelenting. In their respective homes, the four elders were violently ripped from their sleep as their bodies finally recognized the catastrophic threat. It began with sharp, tearing abdominal cramps that felt like hot glass moving through their intestines. This was immediately followed by explosive, uncontrollable purging. Their immune systems were desperately attempting to expel the poison, but it was far too late. The amatoxin was already locked into their internal organs. Sweat soaked their bedsheets as their core temperatures fluctuated wildly between feverish heat and freezing chills. Severe dehydration set in within a matter of hours as their bodies violently rejected even a sip of water. In the Wilkinson household, Ian watched his wife Heather collapse under the sheer physical toll of the agony, entirely unable to stand. Just a few miles away, Don and Gail suffered the exact same horrific descent, isolated in their pain in the dark, early hours of Sunday morning. In their confusion and agony, both couples rationalized the nightmare as an acute, severe case of food poisoning, a bad stomach bug, perhaps contracted from a piece of undercooked meat. They lay on their bathroom floors, waiting for the sickness to pass, unaware that the real damage was completely invisible. Their livers were melting from the inside out. As dawn broke over the rolling hills of Victoria, the situation escalated from a severe illness to a desperate fight for survival. Sunday morning stripped away any remaining illusions of a simple stomach bug. In Korumburra, the quiet suburban streets were shattered by the wail of ambulance sirens. Paramedics arrived at the Patterson and Wilkinson residences to find identical scenes of medical devastation. The patients were severely dehydrated, drifting in and out of consciousness, their skin taking on a pale, waxy pallor. They were loaded onto stretchers and rushed to the local emergency room, where rural physicians immediately initiated aggressive fluid resuscitation. The initial working diagnosis was acute viral gastroenteritis, or a vicious strain of food poisoning. Nurses hung IV bags and administered high doses of anti-nausea medication. But the bodies of the victims did not respond. Instead of stabilizing, their vital signs plummeted. When the first round of comprehensive blood panels returned from the lab, the local medical staff realized they were completely out of their depth. The numbers were terrifying. AST and ALT levels, the enzymes that indicate severe liver trauma, were exponentially higher than anything caused by standard foodborne bacteria. The patients' livers were rapidly dissolving. Recognizing the catastrophic nature of the crisis, emergency transports were arranged. The four elders were heavily sedated, transferred to intensive care ambulances, and rushed roughly 80 miles northwest to specialized medical centers in Melbourne, including the Austin Hospital, a facility renowned for its toxicology and transplant units. The urban specialists took over, immediately recognizing the clinical signature before them. This was acute fulminant hepatic failure. The patients were placed on dialysis machines, their blood routed through external filters in a desperate bid to scrub out whatever was destroying their organs. Toxicologists began working backward, taking detailed clinical histories from the panicked extended family. They needed to pinpoint the exact moment of exposure. The timeline narrowed sharply to the Saturday afternoon gathering in Leongatha. The focal point became the Beef Wellington. With that single piece of information, the medical mystery rapidly clarified into a grim certainty. The symptom progression, a delayed, asymptomatic window followed by violent gastrointestinal distress and rapid organ collapse, was the textbook pathology of Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom. There is no pharmaceutical antidote for amatoxin. Medical science can only offer supportive care, pumping the body with hydration and filtering the blood, hoping the liver can regenerate before the brain swells and the heart stops. For severe exposures, the only definitive cure is a full organ transplant. But for elderly patients whose systems were already buckling under the immense physiological stress, the surgical window was microscopic. The biological clock ran out on Friday, August 4th. 5 days after ingesting the lethal pastry. Heather Wilkinson was the first to succumb. Her internal organs shut down completely, and she passed away in the intensive care unit. The news reached the rural farming community within hours, sending a wave of profound shock through the congregation. But the grief had no time to settle. The very next day, Gail Patterson's liver ceased all function. She died surrounded by the sterile hum of monitors. The town was paralyzed. 2 matriarchs, sisters who had spent their lives serving their neighbors, were suddenly gone. The nightmare continued. As Sunday dawned, Don Patterson's ravaged system finally gave out. He passed away, marking the 3rd fatality from a single dining table. In the span of 8 days, 3 foundational pillars of the local church had been effectively erased. Pastor Ian Wilkinson was the sole guest still clinging to life. He remained in a deeply sedated, medically induced coma. His name was pushed to the absolute top of the National Organ Registry. Every passing hour deteriorated his chances of survival, his life sustained entirely by the relentless mechanical pumping of artificial life support. While the intensive care unit transformed into a staging ground for a mass casualty event, a glaring, impossible anomaly emerged. The medical staff, and soon the authorities, turned their attention to the host of the lunch. Erin had also presented herself to a local hospital shortly after her guests fell ill. She complained of severe abdominal cramping and nausea. She was admitted, observed by doctors, and treated for gastric distress. But her blood work did not mirror the catastrophic organ failure of her former in-laws. Her liver was intact. Her kidneys were functioning. She spent a brief period under medical supervision and was subsequently discharged. The discrepancy was deafening. 5 people sat down at the same wooden table. They shared the same meal, served from the same roasted cylinder of meat and pastry. Yet 4 of them were subjected to a highly concentrated, lethal dose of amatoxin, while the woman who sourced the ingredients, prepared the mushroom paste, and plated the food walked away fundamentally unscathed. Toxicologists and forensic pathologists know that amatoxins do not distribute unevenly by magic. The poison is remarkably stable, baked deep into the fibers of the dish. To have such a staggering difference in clinical outcomes from a single meal suggested something far more sinister than an accidental foraging mistake. It suggested precise, calculated targeting. As the death toll climbed to 3, the clinical phase of the tragedy ended. The hospital corridors gave way to the sharp, scrutinizing light of a criminal investigation. Detectives from the local homicide squad took control of the narrative, cordoning off the sprawling estate, and setting their sights firmly on the surviving cook. The Victoria Police Homicide Squad did not treat the Leongatha estate as the site of a tragic domestic accident. When they executed their first search warrant in early August, they treated it as ground zero for a targeted biological strike. Detectives swarmed the sprawling property, methodically bagging utensils, scrubbing countertops, and seizing the contents of the pantry. They were hunting for the source of the amatoxin. During the initial sweep, investigators faced a meticulously cleaned kitchen. The remnants of the Beef Wellington were gone. The plates were washed. But as detectives began piecing together the timeline of the meal preparation, a glaring physical absence emerged. Certain culinary tools required for handling and preserving dried fungi were missing. When formally questioned by police, Erin provided a shifting, highly detailed narrative designed to explain away the lethal toxicity of her cooking. She maintained that she had prepared the dish using a mixture of 2 distinct types of mushrooms. The first, she claimed, were standard white button mushrooms purchased at a major local supermarket. The second were dried mushrooms, allegedly bought months prior at an unnamed Asian grocery store in Mount Waverley, a suburb of Melbourne, roughly 80 miles away. This assertion immediately triggered a massive secondary crisis. If a commercial retail store was inadvertently selling lethal death cap mushrooms, the entire state was at risk of a mass casualty event. The Department of Health issued urgent, widespread warnings. Detectives were dispatched to scour the Mount Waverley area, interviewing shop owners, auditing import logs, and reviewing months of closed-circuit television footage. It was a frustrating, resource-draining red herring. Investigators found absolutely no evidence of tainted commercial supply chains. No other residents in the state reported amatoxin poisoning. No grocery store in the targeted suburb carried the deadly fungi. The lethal exposure was entirely isolated to the 4 plates served at the Patterson dining table. As the Asian grocery store narrative began to disintegrate under forensic scrutiny, detectives uncovered a far more damning piece of physical evidence. Through a combination of witness statements and neighborhood canvassing, police learned that a specific kitchen appliance had been hurriedly removed from the Leongatha home: a food dehydrator, a machine frequently used to dry and preserve foraged mushrooms. It had not been given away or stored in a garage. It had been driven to the local municipal transfer station and thrown into the landfill. Forensic teams descended on the town dump. Sorting through mountains of heavy, rotting refuse, they successfully located the discarded appliance. It was seized and immediately transported to a secure laboratory for extreme toxicological swabbing. When pressed on why she had thrown away a perfectly functional piece of kitchen equipment in the immediate aftermath of her guest's hospitalization, Erin offered a panicked justification. She claimed through her legal counsel that when her ex-husband Simon began aggressively questioning her about the meal, she became terrified that she would be falsely blamed for the sudden illnesses. In a state of overwhelming distress, she decided to destroy the dehydrator. To seasoned homicide detectives, this psychological defense was entirely transparent. The preemptive destruction of evidence is rarely a trauma response. It is a calculated effort to break the chain of forensic custody. While the police meticulously built their timeline, the towns of Leongatha and Corumbura were buckling under the weight of the tragedy. The social echo was deafening. The community was paralyzed by an overwhelming mix of grief and extreme paranoia. 3 beloved elders were dead. A prominent pastor was on life support, and the woman responsible was still sleeping in her own bed, walking the same streets, and visiting the same local shops. Neighbors began locking their doors. Whispers dominated the aisles of the local markets. The quiet, religious agricultural hub was suddenly thrust under the harsh, unblinking glare of international media. News vans and satellite trucks clogged the quiet, tree-lined road outside the Patterson estate. Reporters camped at the property line, desperate for a statement. Erin eventually emerged, stepping up to the boundary of her property to address the flashing cameras. Standing in the cold winter air, she appeared visibly distraught, wiping away tears as she insisted to the press that she loved her former in-laws. She stated she was utterly devastated by the loss and would never do anything to hurt the people she cared about. The televised display deeply polarized the community. Some viewers saw a grieving mother caught in the center of an impossible, tragic mistake. But the investigators watching the broadcast saw something else entirely. A woman fighting desperately to control a narrative that was rapidly slipping through her fingers. The medical and forensic data simply did not align with a tragic accident. Toxicologists consulted by the prosecution emphasized the physical mechanics of the dish. Amatoxin does not magically migrate to specific sections of a shared meal while leaving other portions pristine. To achieve such a stark disparity in clinical outcomes, where 4 people absorb a fatal dose and the cook walks away unscathed, the poison could not have been accidentally mixed into the general duck cells. It had to be heavily concentrated and deliberately distributed. Furthermore, Erin's claim that she meticulously scraped the dark mushroom paste off her own portion of beef raised massive red flags. The toxin leaches into surrounding tissues. Merely scraping off the solid matter would not prevent the absorption of the poison into the meat itself, unless the cook's portion was prepared and kept entirely separate. With the culinary timeline completely fractured, detectives turned their attention backward. The localized tragedy of the Beef Wellington was horrific, but it was not the beginning of the story. Investigators formally subpoenaed Simon Patterson's medical records from May 2022. They presented the files to the same toxicologists and hepatic specialists currently battling to save Pastor Ian Wilkinson's life. The retrospective analysis was chilling. The violent onset of abdominal pain, the rapid dehydration, the catastrophic spike in liver enzymes, and the 3-week coma. It was an identical clinical match. The symptoms from the previous year were not a mysterious mutated gut infection. They were the unmistakable hallmarks of a sublethal dose of amatoxin. The investigation pivoted instantly. This was no longer a case of a single poisoned lunch. It was a methodical, multi-year campaign of localized biological warfare. the net had finally closed. During the intense hours-long interrogation, she rigidly maintained her innocence, but the authorities had moved far beyond needing a confession. The prosecution formally indicted her on a staggering list of charges. 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Gail, Dawn, and Heather, but it was the attempted murder charges that revealed the true, terrifying scope of the alleged campaign. 5 counts of attempted murder were filed. 1 was for the pastor, Ian Wilkinson. The remaining 4 were exclusively tied to her ex-husband, Simon, detailing a calculated series of suspected poisonings stretching as far back as 2021. Meanwhile, against all medical odds, Pastor Ian Wilkinson woke up. After spending nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma and enduring devastating physical trauma, his liver slowly stabilized without a transplant. He was discharged from the hospital in late September. He returned to his rural hometown, a fragile, grieving widower, stepping back into a community and a church that had been irrevocably shattered by a single afternoon meal. To break bread is the oldest contract of human trust. We inherently assume the hands that feed us intend to nourish, not destroy. In Leongatha, that ancient pact was weaponized, turning a gesture of reconciliation into a calculated biological ambush. Erin Patterson awaits her fate in a cell, leaving behind a hollowed-out congregation and a fractured family line. For a community forever scarred by a single meal, pulling up a chair to a dining table will never feel entirely safe again. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.